I did serve as a United Methodist pastor for 4 years. I was a local pastor. I was never ordained. And I am 5-time champion of the West Virginia Liars Contest. But I was a liar first, just so you know. First year that I won the Liars Contest is held annually over Memorial Day weekend in Charleston, West Virginia. And the rules are pretty simple. There are no politicians allowed to enter the contest. First year that I won the contest, a Presbyterian pastor won second place, and another Methodist minister won third place. So they did consider banning clergy as well after that. I then got a job working for the West Virginia Division of Culture and History, which runs the Liars Contest. Therefore, I could no longer enter the Liars Contest. But I think that does go to show you that if you lie well enough, long enough, eventually the government will hire you. When I got out of divinity school, I got assigned to a little circuit of churches in Fayette County, West Virginia. I had 3 churches. They were 10 miles from a 10-mile circle from my driveway. I guess when they had been built in the late 19th century, early 20th century, they were far apart. But now they were only 3 or 4 miles apart. And we had a character in that community, a guy named Cuss Runner. And Cuss was from long, tall mountain stock. He'd been a member of everything. He liked to join things. He'd been a miner. He'd been a strike breaker. He'd been a Republican. He'd been a Democrat. He'd been a Boy Scout. He'd been a Girl Scout. Been a Rotarian. Been a Lion. He said that he liked to join the side that looked like it was going to throw the first punch. So that's what Cuss did for fun, was fight. Now, for a living, he was a moonshiner. And he was a pretty renowned moonshiner in about 8 counties around us. And there's a great story about Cuss that one time he was in a bar and he got in a little altercation and a fella pulled a 6-shot revolver and stuck it right in Cuss's face. And Cuss said, "I didn't know what to do, so I punched him as hard as I could right in the face. And when I punched him, he threw his arm up like this, pulled the trigger, and shot a hole in the ceiling. So I punched him 5 more times." That was problem solving for Cuss Runner. And Cuss, believe it or not, was not a member of any one of my 3 congregations, but his spouse, Helen, was. And you probably run into this dynamic somewhere in your life where, don't look if they're in here, but where one spouse is always in church and the other spouse is never in church. And Cuss was the member that was never in church. His wife, Helen, though, she was at church no matter what we were doing. If the doors were open, she was there. If we were having a Wednesday afternoon or whatever day of the week it is, Thursday afternoon, luncheon, she was there. Sunday morning services, Sunday night Bible study, Wednesday night meeting, covered dish dinner, cleaning for spring, whatever it was, Helen was in the church, sitting in the front pew, doing what she needed to do. Well, after I'd been at that church for about 6 months, I got a call from Helen. And she said, "Preacher, Cuss is in the hospital. I wondered if you'd go visit him." Now, you'll notice she said, "Go visit him," and not anything like save his soul, because we're Methodists, and that's none of our business. And so I agreed that I would go see Cuss. I had never met Cuss, but he had a reputation. I knew who he was. It was a small town. He knew who I was. And I stepped into the hospital room, and the very first thing that Cuss Runner ever said to me was, "I ain't never had no time for preachers." And even though I shouldn't have, I immediately went on the defensive. And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because preachers always feel like they have to have the last word." And again, I should have said something better than this, but what I said was, "Well, that's our job." And I think that we both took a step back. He took a metaphorical step back, I took an actual step back, and we decided to start this conversation over. And Cuss said to me, "I'm 88 years old. He said, I've had a triple organ transplant. I've had my liver and my pancreas transplanted. I've had quadruple bypass surgery. I have an artificial hip, an artificial knee, and I've lost 3 toes to diabetes." He said, "Now, I'm still as spry as a fawn, but they've done all they can do to my body, and I think it's time I started working on my soul." And after that, when Cuss got out of the hospital, he was in church just like Helen. If the doors were open, Cuss Runner was in the church. And it was really an amazing transformation. He really was, at 88 years old, trying to make some changes in the community, right some wrongs that he had done. And now there were some habits that Cuss had that were frowned upon, not just by most Christian denominations, but by most organized religions in the world. And despite that, he wasn't going to give those habits up. But he really was making an effort to right a lot of the wrongs that he had committed in that community. And he was never going to be able to explain to you the nature of the divinity and the humanity of Christ. He was never going to be able to adequately explain to you how Jesus could be 100% divine and 100% human. He wasn't going to be able to define for you the nature of sin, or to explain to you how the Trinity can be three things, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, while being just one thing. But I thought that was okay, because Cuss was trying to go to heaven, not Harvard. So, and he would come into my office on Sunday mornings before services when I was going over my sermon, not when I was writing my sermon. I wrote those on Saturday night. And he would come in unannounced, sit down at my desk without knocking. I mean, the door was always open, and we would come in, and he would sit down, and he would tell me dirty jokes while I was going over my sermon. And he had taken the time to illustrate many of those jokes on 3x5 index cards. And he would show me the illustrations to those jokes. Now, I should say that none of those illustrations ever made it into any of my sermons, but they did provide good exegetical